Hey everybody, it's Tom Woods, February 23rd, 2012, refuting Robert Parry's article, The Right's Inside-Out Constitution, which takes Ron Paul and other supporters of limited government to task for citing the Constitution in support of their views. Parry says the Constitution is in no way a charter of limited government, and that people like this need to wake up and smell the coffee. Now, at the end of this video, I'll acknowledge there is a sense in which Parry is correct. He doesn't understand that sense. But all the arguments that he himself uses are just dead wrong. And my own personal views aside, I just hate bad arguments, particularly bad arguments that are going to be used to defend dramatic increases in the scope of government power. So I want to go through and look at these arguments and show that Ron Paul's views stand up very well in the face of these objections. So first we have the claim here that it's bad and silly for supporters of limited government to be supporting James Madison as if he were in their camp, because we all know, after all, that James Madison, when he went to the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, supported a dramatically increased federal government in terms of its power and scope, and he favored a national government. He did not go in there favoring a federal government of enumerated powers of the sort that we wound up with. But the point is that when we did wind up with something different from what Madison had proposed, Madison, in the ensuing years, supported the Constitution as it was drafted. The Constitution that appeared was not the nationalist creation that he had wanted it to be. It was a federal government of enumerated powers, and that's what Madison defended. We see this right away in the early 1790s. We see it in the Virginia resolutions of 1798, not mentioned by Parry. I wouldn't have mentioned them if I were him either. He doesn't mention James Madison's report of 1800, also explaining his view of the federal government as being a limited government of enumerated powers, with the states having a right of resistance. That was never even written as far as Robert Parry is concerned. So the point is that although Madison did have these ambitions for the new government, he was honest enough after the federal Constitution was ratified to admit that, okay, what he wanted had not been ratified, and he went ahead and defended the document that was, in fact, drafted. Also, if you're going to be such a big supporter of James Madison, you would want to know, how does James Madison think you interpret the Constitution? Do you look inside James Madison's head? Do you look through his notes of the Philadelphia Convention? No. Madison says you refer to the state ratifying conventions. Now, how many state ratifying conventions do you think are referred to in Robert Parry's article, which in my printing of it runs to 8 pages? 0. Any quotations from any of these ratifying conventions? No, 0. So he loves James Madison, but he doesn't like Madison's interpretive structure for the Constitution, which is you look at the ratifying conventions. And no wonder. If you look at the ratifying conventions, you find in case after case after case, in the ratifying conventions, people are assured that the federal government will have only powers that are expressly delegated to it. Now, later in the article, Parry makes a great deal of the fact that the words expressly delegated don't appear in the Constitution or in the 10th Amendment. But that doesn't matter, because according to Madison, what does matter is not what went on behind closed doors in the Philadelphia Convention or any other source or anything else. What matters is what was discussed out in the open, in public, in the state ratifying conventions. And that's where people were assured that this federal government would have only the powers expressly delegated to it, and that it wouldn't have any supplementary powers. It wouldn't be able to just draw up and appeal to additional reservoirs of powers. Nothing like that appears in the ratifying convention. So it turns out that the limited government people are indeed correct. And Parry is just making this stuff up. He doesn't want to look at the ratifying conventions. All right, I'm going to spare him some of this stuff. Then he quotes us a whole bunch of the prophecies of the anti-federalists. And a lot of these are great prophecies, but prophecies are not law, and they're not relevant to understanding the Constitution. Then we're told that when Madison does seem to support limited government, for example, in certain passages in the Federalist, or as they're known today, the Federalist Papers, well, he says, you got to understand the context. He's trying to defuse the opposition. So he's trying to downplay some stuff and play up other stuff. Okay, so Parry is saying, if we're to believe his interpretation of Madison, he's saying that Madison is basically trying to dupe people. So you've got to understand the context. He's trying to dupe people when he claims that the powers of the federal government are few and defined, and the powers remaining to the states are numerous and indefinite. You've got to understand the context. He knows that people in the ratifying conventions aren't really going to go for all this stuff, so he's got to kind of dupe them, basically. Well, all right, I mean, I guess if you want to make an argument like that, but I would say to the contrary that if these are his public arguments, then I think we have to take them at their word, right? We have to interpret them as he is uttering them and not say that, well, this, we all know this is basically some kind of a lie, so this doesn't have to have anything to do with our interpretive framework. He tries to claim that Madison believes in the constitutionality of federal spending on internal improvements. But you know what? Actions speak louder than words. What did Madison actually do when he was in power? Well, read the bonus bill veto of 1817, an extremely strict constructionist view in which he vetoes appropriations for these things in the absence of a constitutional amendment. So there's another failed argument. He goes on to say, Parry does, that this strong and energetic central government that was created under the Constitution was flexible so that it could respond to future unanticipated problems. Yes, the flexibility is called the amendment process, which is, again, is not referred to even once in this article. To the contrary, we're supposed to believe that we'll just wake up every morning and we'll just see what the judges have discovered are the additional powers of the federal government that no one anticipated at the time. No one would have ratified a document like this, and as I say, the people were assured of the expressly delegated scheme. Then we're told that the 10th Amendment is really just a modest concession. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't have the same language that appeared in the Articles of Confederation. Again, what matters is, as Madison says, what we heard at the state ratifying conventions, and there you do have expressly delegated and discussions of sovereignty and so on. Then Parry goes on to say, look, we've also got Andrew Jackson, who takes, in some cases, for example, in the nullification crisis, a broad view of federal powers, and he's very much opposed to some of the views of state sovereignty that we hear a lot in the Tea Party, so-called, and in among people who favor limited government. But Jackson was obviously not some kind of infallible authority, for heaven's sake. Andrew Jackson, of all people. To the contrary, Jackson was pretty much smashed in his argument that he made in the nullification process by Littleton Waller Tazewell, who also does not appear in this article. But you can read all about this in my book, Nullification, because I talk about the Constitution, what some of these clauses, like the General Welfare Clause, originally meant. I go through the Andrew Jackson view, and I explain what was the United States. This article basically is of the view that the United States is supposed to be one giant thing, and that we're trying to get past this old-fashioned, silly, old-fashioned view of the United States just being a collection of states. That's just stupid and backward, and it leads to oppression and inefficiency, and we know that all the cool people favor political centralization. Well, to the contrary, as I show in Nullification, that is not true of the United States. You look at the Constitution, not one time is the United States referred to in the singular. The emphasis is on the plurality of societies that we have in the American system. And then finally, let's see how he ends here. Then he ends by, of course, saying that people who favor limited government more or less support slavery and segregation. I've dealt with this a million times before. It's typical smear tactic. If you look at the most dangerous places for racial minorities to live in the world, it's not highly decentralized federal structures. I've used as examples Uganda. You can look at Africa, Asia, Europe. You can look at, in European history, there are pretty obvious examples. Hitler's Germany. You can look at the Soviet Union and the Ukrainians. Time and again, you can look at the poor Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire. This is not exactly a structure aimed at maximizing individual liberty. To the contrary, what we want is to maximize the number of jurisdictions rather than one giant jurisdiction, which if some sociopath takes power, then there go all your liberties. But the point, ultimately, of this essay is to try to argue that the federal government has a whole lot of unspecified powers and yet not once refer to the sources you are supposed to look to understand the federal Constitution. Now, I said at the beginning, Parry may be right to some degree, and I think he is. Basically, the point in which he is right, without realizing it, is that There's no way to keep governments limited to what constitutions say. Now, all his arguments are terrible, they're refuted by the evidence, but there is this fundamental problem with constitutions. They're just pieces of paper. They don't grow fangs when governments violate them. And so, sure, in the Constitution's ratifying conventions, people were assured the federal government would have only expressly delegated powers. So Parry is dead wrong. But the problem is, how do you enforce this? How do you enforce that promise made at the ratifying conventions? And it's because of that problem that we're ultimately reduced to wondering whether written constitutions can, in the long run, limit governments after all. Thanks for listening.